He had one foot out the door the day my little boy leaned over and whispered a secret that would destroy everything. I still remember the sound of it. A small, serious voice in the dark. The hush of a house that thought it was asleep. My breath stopped. A cold rush ran through me like winter water. The clock on the wall ticked too loud. I could smell the dish soap from the sink where I'd left a mug, and I tasted metal in my mouth, the way fear makes everything taste thin. His warm breath against my neck, the tiny rhythm of it, felt like a confession. He said, "There's a woman," my son said, "and they will take all your money." Those words landed like a stone dropped through glass. For a moment, I could only feel, my hands shaking, the weight of the sheets, the little bump of his shoulder as he tried to scoot closer. Then the mind began its slow, terrible work, combing through the easy smiles, the routine kisses, the quiet promises. A decade of ordinary trust suddenly looked brittle, like a house of cards in a draft. What came after was not a movie of fancy revenge. It wasn't dramatic violence or a sudden public blaze. It was something sharper in its own way, a careful unraveling, a quiet exposure that left him speechless in front of the people who mattered and gave me back the safety I thought I'd lost. You'll see him shrink and stumble and watch as every excuse he'd built starts to come apart. You'll watch me find pieces of truth tucked in bank statements and late-night receipts, and you'll feel the exact second I stopped being the woman who forgave because it was easier and became the woman who would protect her child at any cost. If you've ever been backstabbed by someone you trusted, or you long for the kind of justice that leaves you breathing easier, like subscribe and comment your own story below, this one's going to hit hard. Picture a flash, my son's small face lit by a hallway light, my husband's figure blurred as he walks away, a bank statement folded and shoved into a drawer like a secret. That's where it began, a whisper. A drawer, a decision. It started with a whisper, but it didn't end until everything was out in the open. He made the coffee the way he always did, too strong for my taste, perfect for his. The kettle hissed awake before the sun did, and steam rose in a lazy ribbon that smelled like burnt sugar and the tiny consolation of routine. Our kitchen was small but honest, white mugs with chipped rims stacked by the sink, a dish towel with a faded pattern that had been his grandmother's, the calendar over the stove where I crossed off days with a black pen. Morning light slid in thin through the blinds and painted the table with pale bars. I remember the sound of the floorboard near the pantry, complaining under his weight. It had a stubborn creak that I thought of as part of home. Our son shuffled in with sticky hair and a half-eaten cereal bowl, the very picture of sleepy contentment. He always padded in like a small warm animal, still blinking away sleep. He climbed up into his chair and reached for the jam jar without looking. He hummed under his breath, some tune that belonged to cartoons and school mornings, and it made me feel steadier, like the world was still on the axis I trusted. My husband came through the back door in his work shirt, collar already wrinkled from the day ahead. He kissed my temple without looking at me. He wrinkled his nose at the coffee and joked about my attempt to make real espresso. He had the kind of easy charm that warmed strangers and smoothed conversations. People liked him. People noticed him. He told better stories than he should, laughed more than made sense, and had a way of turning everything small into something bright. That's why I married him, not just his smile, the way he noticed where the light landed on the floor and stopped to point it out to me, the way he tied shoelaces and folded laundry like a small ritual. "Don't forget your lunch," I said, and he stuck his hand in his pocket and pulled out a paper bag already labeled in his quick, messy handwriting. "You sure you don't want me to drop it off?" I asked, as though lunch was the anchor that held us together in small ways. "I'm fine," he said. "Really?" He kissed our son's hair, tousled it, and walked out the door with a half-sung line of a song I didn't know. Those mornings were ordinary in the way mountains are ordinary until you notice the crack. We had habits. Late Friday pizza, a particular Sunday we spent at the flea market, a promise that every summer we'd try a new place even if we never left the county. He handled the bills mostly. It had been like that since our son was born. Practical decisions parceled out according to who had time, who had skill. I trusted him with numbers the way I trusted him with children's fevers and bedtime stories. When a bank notification pinged on his phone, he was the one to check it. When mortgage paperwork arrived, he put it on the kitchen counter with a soft, "I'll take care of it." There was ease in that. I mistook ease for safety. I remember the bank app once, idly glancing at a screen when he handed me his phone to show a picture. The balance numbers were there, benign and impassive, a cold proof of normalcy. I saw nothing alarming, I saw stability. The screen was a little blur of numbers and receipts, and I put the phone back in his hand, trusting his casual smile as if it were a seal. If you asked me then whether anything could threaten our small household, I would have laughed in disbelief. Of course it could, but I didn't then. Not yet. It wasn't a lack of looking that left me blind. It was a trust that hid its eyes. He was good at appearing exactly what I needed. He listened to the stories of my exhausted days, and he remembered anniversaries. The marriage folded around the ordinary. We had keys in both our names, a drawer where spare change accumulated, catalogs with circled items for one day, the way the house smelled of lemon-scented cleaner on Sunday mornings. I like to think of us as a team, and his handling of the money felt like part of that shared life. Not a relinquishment, but a role we had agreed on. I had long accepted his competence as fact. It made my life easier, it made my love easier. There were small things, the kind of almost things that slip past like moths in a curtain. A message deleted a little too fast as he slid his phone under a newspaper when I walked into the room. A night when I woke to voices that hushed like someone turning down the volume on the house. I shuffled to the hallway and caught a sliver of conversation through the thin door. 2 soft tones and then silence. And when I knocked, he said, "Just work stuff," with the same sheepish grin he wore when he burnt the toast. The explanations fit like a glove. I wanted them to fit. He could be distracted, yes. He would lose track of appointments, forget where he'd left his keys, stand with a bewildered stare at the open refrigerator as if it might reveal the answer to some private question. But then he would snap back and apologetic lines would cross his forehead and everything felt forgiven again. That is the thing about charm. It softens suspicion like water softens stone. I can still hear his laugh in the yard, see him bent over with our son teaching him to tie his shoes, the slow, proud smile of a father who is also his child's hero. That image anchored me more than any bank statement ever could. Our son was observant in the way kids can be, a collector of small truths. How the light fell from the window at 4 p.m., the exact number of steps to the tree in the yard, the way the cat meowed for attention. He noticed things we thought were invisible. He watched my husband the way a bee watches a flower, not fully understanding why the flower sometimes leaned away from the sun. Sometimes he asked small, startling questions. Why did Daddy look sad when he got the mail today? Or, why was Daddy on the phone at midnight? I always deflected with the softest answers I could muster because what else was there to say? Adults have their reasons. Adults have oceans of complication. We let them swim in alone. There were nights he would wake and quietly slip into our bed, all knees and breath, and he would curl up between us. My husband would reach out and tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, and then, in those private blink-of-an-eye moments, it would seem again that everything was whole. I would think, this is my life, messy and beloved. The small domestic rituals anchored me, the child's foot finding mine under the covers, the lid of the saucepan that never fit quite right, the way he always left the same dent in the sofa arm where his elbow rested. And yet, under the surface, the small oddnesses began to multiply. A bottle of cologne that smelled slightly different from the one in his drawer. A receipt for dinner at a restaurant he claimed never to have visited. He had a way of apologizing that made you accept the apology before you could examine its edges. I told myself stories to smooth the roughness. Maybe a client took him out. Maybe he bought someone a gift. Maybe my tired eyes had decided to see a pattern where none existed. It's easy to forget the cold light of a moment when the warmth is constant. It's easy to mistake continuity for truth. There was one morning, ordinary as any other, when my son sat very still in his chair and watched his father tie his tie. He watched how he knotted it with practiced fingers and his small face made a question I didn't hear at first. "Mom," he said suddenly, like a pebble dropped in a glass bowl, "where is Daddy going?" "Work," I said. It sounded silly even as I said it. He tilted his head and looked at my husband with that clear, unjudging look children have, like a compass checking north. My husband kissed his forehead before heading out. He ruffled our son's hair. He smiled at me in the door, a quick, assured thing, and then the back door closed. Our son's gaze lingered on the closed door longer than he usually did. He fumbled with his cereal spoon, and then, instead of the bright chatter he usually offered, he said, "Bye, Daddy," in a voice that was almost an afterthought. And then he was quiet, and I noticed the way his small shoulders had drawn inward like he'd been bracing for something. That look, that small bruise of attention on his face, is what I hold now when I think of that time. It seemed almost nothing then, only a child watching a parent go to work. But there was a weight under it I couldn't name then, a thin tension like the wire of a phone line pulled taut. It made me watch him in a way I hadn't before, placing my attention on the little pattern of his movements, the small changes in his play, the questions that came unbidden to his mouth. I fell asleep that night thinking of the simple things that make up days, the smell of clean sheets, the soft hum of the heater, the way our son's breathing slowed into sleep. I told myself I was safe. I told myself our life was intact. I wanted to believe it with a hunger that surprised me. 3 nights later, my boy came to my bedside and said 2 words that made my blood run cold. He climbed into bed the way he always did, a small body, knees knocking softly against mine until he found his place beside me. The house was a low, sleeping thing. The refrigerator hummed like a distant engine. The nightlight from the hallway spilled a pale pool on the carpet, and somewhere, a car went by. Tires whispering past. Outside, the world was asleep. Inside, my son's breath was warm and close, a rhythm I'd learned by heart. "Mom," he said, his voice barely a thread. He smelled of milk and jam and the faint tang of playground dust. He always smelled like small, uncomplicated things. He said, "There's a woman," he whispered into the crook of my neck, "and they will take all your money." The words were so small, they should have been nothing. Instead, they lodged like a splinter. I felt it before I heard it. A tightening behind my ribs, the heat slackening from my fingers. My heart kicked. The room tilted. For a handful of seconds, I couldn't find the air. The hum of the refrigerator became loud and obscene. I could feel the bed under me, the familiar quilt, the soft thump of my son's knee against mine. I told myself, breathe, breathe. Simple. But the breath came shallow, ragged, like someone had taken the depth out of the night. No, this can't be. Short, hard, I wanted to shove the thought away with the kind of violence we reserve for small emergencies. A fever, a scraped knee. My mind raced through denials as if they were lifelines. He's tired, he's been watching TV late. Children make up stories. But the image of my son's earnest face against my shoulder anchored the sentence in me. He was not acting. He was only telling me what he had seen. I kept my voice gentle. I always kept my voice gentle with him. Panic would close the conduit. "Tell me exactly what you saw," I said, careful to sound like a woman asking about scraped knees instead of a woman asking about treachery. He spoke in small, clear pieces. I saw her at Daddy's phone. He said the words the way you report a bird on the windowsill, simple, factual. She was in pictures. She made him smile like when he eats cake. She gave him a little box. He put it under the bed. They hugged. Not like Daddy hugs me, a different hug. A different hug, I repeated, because it sounded like something from a storybook and also like the thinnest possible rope leading to the truth. "Did you see her face?" I asked. "No," he said. "He showed me a photo. He put the phone away when you came. He told me to go to bed." He snuffled, then leaned closer. He said it was for work. For work? The phrase trembled in the dark like a joke that wasn't funny. I asked the questions I already knew I had to ask. When did you see the phone? Where were you? Who else was there? His answers were small and exact and didn't help me the way I wanted. Children don't build conspiracies. They remember scenes. They see impressions. They don't have motives. They have blunt facts. A photo, a box, a hug. In the morning, I moved through the house as if someone had rearranged the furniture. The sunlight looked different. Too bright. Too accusing. I made coffee and nearly burned my tongue because my hands were still damp with sleeplessness. When he kissed my forehead in the doorway, I felt the weight of each second like a ledger balancing. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked. His voice was casual, shirt rumpled around the collar, tie flung over his shoulder, keys already in his palm. "Fine," I said. My voice had a strange float to it. I poured coffee into the wrong mug and forced a laugh. "You packed your lunch?" He rolled his eyes. "Yes, mother hen. Don't unplug my phone this morning." There it was, the small domestic ridiculousness. I wanted to listen to it like music. I wanted to believe in the rhythm we had kept for years. But as he spoke, his smile tightened oddly at the edges. A tiny flinch, a quick, downward glance at his hand where the keys landed. It was nothing. Or it was everything. I watched him go and felt the silence come back as though someone had closed the door on it. That day, I walked around the kitchen like a ghost, tethered to a life I no longer recognized. The refrigerator hummed. The radio played an old song that made me ache. I found myself glancing at his phone when it buzzed on the counter. A reflex, a habit, plain curiosity. He always left it face down. That morning it lay face up for one instant because he'd grabbed it and forgotten. The lock screen flashed a small, impersonal notification and then darkened again the way a watched thing does when you're trying to see if it will move. I justified my stare. It was parental curiosity. It was idle. It was nothing serious. I told myself again and again, adults have little fraternities. They have colleagues and jokes and people who share details you don't hear about. It was normal. It was normal. It was normal. That night, I found myself awake in the small hours, the house a dim, breathing thing. I rehearsed how I would ask him about the whisper. I practiced my voice in the safety of the dark, shaping sentences to be neutral, to be open, to be loving. "Is there something you want to tell me?" I would say. Anything at all, no judgments. I wanted to make it a conversation. I wanted to demand the truth without snapping the brittle threads of whatever our life was. The rehearsals were useless. When the quieter moment came, I hesitated. My throat tightened. I felt ridiculous to be even considering it. I turned over instead. I put my back to the possibility and pretended sleep would come if I let it. But the whisper lived in me like a thing with teeth. I found myself watching for evidence in the way you scan a room for a hidden mouse. Small signs, crumbs, a smear of fur. I noticed the way he texted when he thought I wasn't looking. I noticed his laugh at odd times, the way he checked his watch. I noticed small purchases on our shared account, things I didn't recognize at first, a little here, a little there. I told myself they were for work, for clients, for people we knew to be expensive. I told myself not to look. Curiosity changed into a quiet, creeping fear. I started to check bank statements like someone peeking through a cracked door. I told myself I was merely being prudent. What if it was nothing? What if I was the one making a mountain out of a molehill? Still, there was the whisper to contend with, the image of his hand closing over the phone, the way my son's small shoulders had curled inward, like a person bracing from a storm. If you've ever been awake at night with the kind of small dread that makes you count ceiling tiles, you know how the mind pulls at a single thread until the whole sweater threatens to unravel. I became a scholar of detail. I looked for receipts in the junk drawer. I skimmed the calendar for odd appointments. I took time to remember the smallest things. The exact date he had left town for a meeting. The name of a restaurant he mentioned in passing. One afternoon when the house was quiet and our son was at school, I sat with my hands wrapped around a mug and watched his phone on the kitchen counter like a charged animal. He had set it face down again. I told myself I wouldn't look. I told myself I would regret it. My fingers moved of their own accord. I slipped it up, unlocked it with the pattern he always used because sometimes comfort is habit and habits beget forgetting. I know how it sounds. I know the shape of transgression, but fear is cunning. It makes thieves of us all. There was nothing overt. A message thread with a name I didn't know. A photo, cropped so the face was cut off. Of 2 plates on a table and a hand near a glass. A text that said, in a voice that could have been casual, "See you Friday." No explicit confessions, no guarantees. Just the kind of breadcrumb that is enough to start a hunt. The phone slipped back into place like nothing had happened. I closed the kitchen drawer, my hands cooling with a strange hollow steel. I had invaded his privacy. I felt guilty and righteous in equal messy measures. Days after, sleep became a visitor I could no longer count on. I lay awake and let confrontations play out in the dark like movies that start in the middle. I practiced slamming his phone on a table and asking, "Who is she?" I practiced gentle ways to ask. I practiced accusing him the way a woman might accuse an unfaithful husband in a novel, sharp and unforgiving. Each rehearsal ended with me sobbing a little, feeling ashamed for even imagining the scene, then furious with myself for the same reason. The rehearsed words tasted metallic in my mouth. My son's questions became pins under my skin. He would draw pictures of our family and leave tiny, empty spaces in the circle where perhaps he felt an absence. He would ask routinely, "Will Daddy be back for the game?" And I would answer with a tone that was more certain than I felt. I learned the language of small lies. I practiced my face in the mirror to make sure concern read as calm, that worry read as patience. A mother's work is performance when the home is dangerous, I thought. We perform safety for the small ones as if it is the last medicine. The nights grew heavier. I found myself walking through the house at odd hours, listening to the house breathe, letting the hum of appliances and the tick of the clock keep me company. I made lists. I checked bank alerts. I called our bank's customer service under the pretense of a forgotten password and listened for the inflection in the voice that could indicate urgency. Paranoia is a slippery thing. It feeds on itself. But there was that voice in my son's whisper to contend with. The idea that our finances, the small empire of savings we had accumulated for college, for a rainy day roof, for the mundane and sacred things that keep children fed and warm, could be taken without my knowledge made my stomach empty. And then I found something I couldn't laugh off. One afternoon, I opened the account app on my computer to check a routine balance. The number blinked. Everything seemed normal at first. I scrolled through recent transactions, expecting to see the same grocery receipts and utility payments, the same predictable strips of expense that made up our life. Then there it was. A charge I didn't recognize. A restaurant in a part of town my husband didn't frequent. A boutique with a name that looked more like a brand than a business. The amount wasn't obscene. It was small enough to be explained away if you wanted to explain it away. But the date matched a night he had said he'd been at a work function. The charge was on a Thursday when he said he'd been home late, finishing a report. I stared at the screen until the letters crawled. The hum of the refrigerator seemed suddenly obscene again. The world narrowed to the glowing rectangle in my lap. My hands shook. The mug went cold at my elbow. A cold sweat gathered at the base of my skull. This was nothing. This was nothing. That was the first whisper of the denial you give yourself. He must have taken me out that night. He must have bought something for the house. He has friends who take him out. The brain is a skilled liar. But alongside the rationalizations was a second, darker thought that felt like a truth. It could be for her. I felt ridiculous and small and enormous all at once. How was it possible that a few pixels on a screen could make the house feel like a stranger's? How could numbers make me consider a future I'd never planned for? One where I had to fight to keep what was mine for my child. I should have stopped there. Instead, I followed the breadcrumb. I turned detective in slippers. It began with small, nightly rituals, the laptop humming on the kitchen table, a mug cooling beside it, the house settling into its late breaths. I set an old blanket over my knees and opened our account history like you might open a book you were scared to read. The screen's glow was the only light in the room. Outside, a dog barked twice and died away. Inside, the cursor blinked like a quiet heart. 0, 25, 0, 28, montage. I scrolled, I scrolled again. I zoomed on numbers until the digits blurred and revealed patterns where none had been obvious. I checked timestamps, hovered over vendor names, clicked into transaction details. Small transfers, recurring charges, tiny fees that at first looked like nothing. A cafe charge here, a boutique there, each one a breadcrumb. I printed a few pages and pinned them to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. I wrote dates in ink. I circled amounts with a red pen. The sound of the printer feeding paper was like a sealing sound. 0:29, 0:33, montage, pacing cue. Minutes stretched into hour. The kitchen clock read 2:11 a.m., then 3:07 a.m., then 3:59 a.m. My eyes burned. My shoulders ached. Every ping of the phone made my chest leap. I found myself whispering to the empty room as though it might answer back. It was practical work, cold, methodical. I treated it like a job where emotions were a liability. I cataloged deliveries. A florist's charge at midnight, a private dining tab on a day he claimed to be in the office, a rideshare pickup near a hotel downtown at 11:45 p.m. I tracked dates against his calendar entries and his stories. They didn't line up. The more I matched one against the other, the more the gaps looked deliberate. Then there were the people I asked without meaning to. A delivery driver I cornered in the hallway after he trundled a box into our building. "Did you order a delivery for Mr. his name?" He glanced at me like I was a curious relative and admitted, "Yeah, ma'am. Came for him late last week. Sign here." His eyes flicked past me. He mumbled something about the lobby being quiet if asked for details. The interaction was short, polite, and loaded. It told me someone had been receiving things at odd hours. It told me there were hands I hadn't seen. The neighbor across the hall, a retired woman who knitted at a window, mentioned, offhand, that she'd seen our husband getting into his car with a large paper bag, smiling differently than she'd ever seen him on the other side of the building. She said it as though she were offering a trivial observation about a fox passing through a yard. "He looked pleased," she said, tapping her knitting needle, "like someone had fed him a sweet." Her words lodged in me. They were small and trivial and therefore more frightening. The credit card statements gathered like evidence. There was a name I didn't recognize that kept surfacing, each entry with a different amount. A boutique on the north side with a name that read like the title of a song. An odd recurring transfer to an account in a nearby town. I started mapping it all out on a corkboard in the spare room, strings connecting names to charges and dates like a crime drama I never auditioned to star in. The husband, I knew, moved through my diagrams like a ghost I could not quite catch. At home, things changed. He was there and not there, present like a stagehand behind the curtain. Conversation grew clipped. He would answer questions with phrases designed to close the topic. "Just work stuff. You know how it is. Don't worry about it." When I asked directly about late nights, his smile softened into something practiced. When I asked about the florist charge, he said, "Oh, that. Just a client thing. Don't be silly." A knightly phrase, a shield. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to be woman enough to trust him still. But my son watched from the doorway, and I watched back like someone learning the false comfort of a magician's hand. There were small fights, not explosive arguments, but flares of sharpness that left a bruise on our daily rhythm. I confronted him gently, because even anger has to be measured when children sleep in the next room, and he deflected with humor, with a touch of wounded confusion that made me question the legitimacy of my own suspicion. "You're imagining things," he'd say with a too-soft grin. "You haven't slept." He used small domestic jibes like velvet ropes to keep me from leaning too close. Those deflections stung. They also did something more dangerous. They made me doubt the validity of the trail I was following. Was I seeing what was there or projecting fear into minor anomalies? I told myself to breathe. I told myself to gather more. Evidence, not emotion. The breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The sun had the tired wash of late summer. Our son was at school and I had a meeting I couldn't miss, or so I said as I left the house. I drove to the bank after the meeting because my chest would not settle. The The branch smelled like hand soap, and the carpeting had a faint institutional chill. I asked for statements. Recent history, printed and official. The clerk was polite, the kind of small talk practiced by people who hand out forms for a living. I watched him fill the pages, his pen moving like the tick of a clock. I spread the pages on the table in my car in the sunlight and scanned line by line until my mouth tasted of metal. There it was, a transfer in the 5-figure range that wasn't there the month before, moving to an account I didn't recognize. It had a memo line so small it seemed intentionally obscure. No name I knew, no obvious purpose. My hands tightened around the edges of the paper until my knuckles whitened. The world narrowed into the slit of that number. I thought horribly and immediately of our son's future, college funds, the roof, the small savings we'd scraped together for patching the car or an emergency that never arrives until it does. I felt the bright, hot necessity of protecting that future like a physical thing rising in my throat. I didn't think about revenge then. I thought about shelter. I thought about childcare and the safety of a child who would never understand the arithmetic of broken promises. I have to protect my son, I said aloud, as if speaking could conjure a plan. The words tasted like stone. There was a moral weight to what I was about to do next. Snooping is a breach. Curiosity can be an unkind thing that undoes trust. I sat in my car and argued with myself until the engine growled a small protest. Should I call a lawyer then? Should I confront him directly and demand the truth with the force of accusation? Should I leave? Questions stacked like plates. I felt the tremor of dread and the stubborn pressure of survival pressing at me until the choice seemed clear. Privacy is a beautiful thing until it protects harm. I could wait for proof and watch our life be picked away in quiet increments, or I could pry. It began as protection. Each choice I made felt like armor placed over my son. I told myself the end justified the means. The whisper had tipped the scales. I found an ally in small, slow ways. My sister was the first person I told in a voice muffled by the phone. Her reaction was a furnace, fierce and immediate and practical. "Freeze accounts," she said. "Get copies of everything. Talk to the bank and explain you suspect fraudulent activity." Her words were taught with the kind of love that knows how to be merciless for your sake. She offered a lawyer's name with the easy certainty of someone who knows how to fight for her people. My friend, Mara, the kind who shows up with casseroles and blunt advice, came by and looked at me like someone assessing a broken thing. She made coffee without asking and then sat with me at the kitchen table while I explained, breathless and embarrassed. "You don't have to be brave alone," she said. "You deserve to know." She told me about a woman she knew who'd taken similar steps quietly and lived to tell the story. Her voice was steady like mortar. A neighbor, the woman with knitting needles, provided a different kind of counsel. "If you want proof," she said, something like a warning and a prophecy, "start simple. Don't let him know you know." She slid me a small pad of paper with a scribble of times she'd noticed lights in our building at odd hours. She had watched without wanting to be the one to say it out loud, but she said it now, and her eyes shone with the particular cruelty of someone who knows private grief. I began to set traps that felt more like safety measures than entrapments. I called the bank and asked for explanations in the blandest voice I could muster. I set up alerts to ping my phone for transactions over a certain limit. I froze the ability to make wire transfers without a second approval. There is a small practical satisfaction in these things. The sound of bureaucracy responding to a human plea. The bank smiled, wrote down procedures, and scheduled a meeting. The legal name of protective measures sounded less messy than the dark feelings that had led me there. At night, I learned to listen for patterns. I sat on the couch with the lights low and waited to hear his car in the driveway. When the back door clicked shut and his footsteps ghosted up the stairs at odd hours, I noted the time. When he claimed late reports and then posted a picture at a restaurant in a part of town he claimed not to know, I saved the images. I became a careful archivist of contradiction. Our conversations grew colder. "Are you okay?" he asked on one night, standing in the doorway as though he might be the one to offer me consolation. I looked at him and felt the compass in my chest shift. "I'm fine," I said. Lies hang between people like thin sheets of ice. He nodded, relief smoothing his face, and then went to bed without asking further questions. The distance between us felt physical now, like an unfurnished room. Then, just when the map I'd been drawing looked like it might only be a rumor, a small, undeniable image arrived. It was a message to a number on my husband's phone, a photo thread someone had sent him, perhaps accidentally, perhaps without care. The image was grainy but telling. Two bodies close in a doorway, one hand clasped around another, a head resting near a shoulder. The angle suggested casual familiarity more than a snapshot of friends. There was a small cup on the stair rail, steam ghosting from it. The timestamp matched a date when our son had asked where his father had been. The message beneath it read simply, "Last night was perfect. See you soon." I did not see intent to steal written in the pixels. I saw intimacy. I saw what my child had tried to explain with clumsy adjectives. I saw another person at the center of my husband's late nights. I stared at that image until it burned a spot into my retinas. But even that, sharp as it was, did not tell me about the money. It did not show the transfer, the account, the plan to siphon savings. It showed the motive of distraction and affection, the emotional betrayal, but not the ledger that would destroy my son's future. Still, it was a hard proof of collusion. It was a photograph of two lives overlapping in ways mine had not been invited into. It changed the texture of my fear to a cold and furious insistence. I folded the printout into my wallet like a talisman and put it next to the list of transactions. Next to the lawyer's card, next to the names of people who might help me call things by their legal names. I felt the floor drop away and steadied myself by thinking in steps. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about meticulousness. It was about ensuring my son would never have to count pennies and learn the taste of betrayal as a survival skill. I thought of the quiet basement where our photo albums lived, the pennies scraped into jars labeled college in a child's scrawl. Those small objects now had the force of a crusade. I assembled a list of options and laid them before me like cards in a hand I was learning to play. Freeze accounts. Get formal statements. Confront with counsel present. Document everything. Make no rash moves. The moral question nipped at me in the quiet hours. Was this vindication or vindictiveness? Was my motive righteous protection or a hunger for retribution? I let the question sit and then pushed it aside. Protecting my child was not revenge. It was the last decent thing I could do. And in that still, sharp moment with proofs, small and weighty in my hands and allies on speed dial, I realized something dangerous and empowering at the same time. If he was moving money, if an account or a legal form had been opened without my consent, the clock was ticking. If I waited for the perfectly damning piece of evidence, I might lose everything in the interim. If the transfer was already in motion, a pause could funnel it away for good. I had to act carefully, and I had to act now. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were a child's future, an education fund, the possibility of keeping a home with a roof that didn't leak. The emotion that once wanted nothing more than to watch him humiliate and be humiliated had grown into something else, a fierce, focused protection. And then I received a message that made the whole thing unbearably real. A photo taken at a restaurant table, the woman's hand tucked in his, their faces laughing at something private. The timestamp matched the charges. The smile on his face was not the boyish charm I had married. It was almost arrogant in its casualness. Here was the proof of intimacy. Here was the appearance of conspiracy. But still, no paper trail showing the plan to empty our accounts. He could claim 1,000 things. The legal proof might still be missing. I stood in the small, dim kitchen, the evidence surrounding me like a field I had to cross, and I felt a cold certainty settle into the hollow under my ribs. I realized the only safe move was to stop him before the plan finished. I chose to be clever instead of violent. The whisper had taken my breath. The evidence had given me purpose. Now, in the cold light that followed fear, I set about building a plan with the kind of care you give a fragile antique you mean to save. Not revenge for spectacle, not a grand, cruel spectacle meant to shame. That felt small and petty in the face of a child's future. This was strategy. This was defense. I made a list the way a surgeon prepares instruments. I wrote it down in a small notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer, the one with the stray batteries and shopping lists. I titled the page in block letters, Protect. Under it, each line was a command, precise and unmoving. Freeze large transfers, duplicate bank statements, official copies, document receipts and dates, record incriminating admissions, legal in my state if recorded consenting. Note, check with counsel, preserve phone messages and photos, set alerts for withdrawal thresholds, speak to lawyer, confidential. Don't confront alone, protect son's routine, hide fear. Each line became a mini-scene I rehearsed in my head like a script. Freeze large transfers. I pictured the bank's polite voice saying, "We can place a hold," and the odd practical relief that follows a bureaucrat's formality. Duplicate statements. I imagined paper sliding out of a printer like truth made tangible. Document receipts. I pictured my hands folding small slips of paper, tucking them into envelopes labeled with dates. Record admissions. That was the dangerous, careful one. It had to be done cleanly, legally, with counsel in the background if necessary. Preserve messages. I imagined a folder on my computer with every text thread and photo consolidated like evidence in a case. I made calls. I practiced my voice beforehand until it sounded neutral instead of shattered. I called the lawyer my sister had recommended. The line was a lifeline. When I said, "I need to protect my son and my savings," the lawyer's voice was flat and efficient and somehow kind in the way professionals are. "We will move carefully. Do not confront him. Let the bank freeze anything you suspect. Gather everything. We will advise on recording laws and any immediate injunctions." His words transformed my panic into a plan. Legal counsel offered process. It gave me permission to translate fear into action, and that was everything. I felt the vapor of panic condense into steel. Next, practical armor. I called the bank, using my account credentials, my voice steady because practice makes steadiness habitual. They set up transaction alerts to my phone and placed a temporary hold protocol I could activate with a single call. They told me what they could see and what they needed from me to flag suspicious activity. Printouts, authorization forms, identity verification. The rhythm of the bureaucracy was oddly comforting. It felt like procedure for wrongs, a set of precise moves that could, at least, make ruin harder. I changed passwords. I switched two-factor authentication to my phone number. I adjusted accounts so that no single person could move large sums without the other's approval, or, at least, I attempted to. Some instruments had already been set up without my knowledge, and those would require legal intervention. The little victories counted, a password strength meter creeping into the green, an email confirmation landing like a small flag, a bank rep saying, "Done." But the heart of the plan was proof. I needed a moment where my husband would, in his own words, reveal the intent behind the comfort and the dinners. I needed a voice, a ledger, paper, a small constellation of facts that could not be shrugged off as work stuff. I needed incontrovertible evidence tying the intimacy to the transfers. I staged a bait that felt like the most ordinary domestic trick, a lunch invitation that would be just a chat. I asked a mutual acquaintance, someone my husband knew through work and who owed me a favor, to suggest meeting at a small cafe near the office. The friend was careful and kind. She agreed to be the innocent hook. "Keep it soft," she warned. "Make it natural. We don't want him to smell a trap." The parking lot smelled of oil and wet asphalt the day I chose. There was the low, consistent drone of a fountain at the cafe's edge, water hitting stone in a steady, unremarkable pattern that I would later use as a metronome for my own nerves. I sat at a table by the window, coffee cooling too fast, phone on the table with the record function ready. The cafe's hum was ordinary, chairs scraping, hushed conversations, the hiss of espresso machines. The world moving as it always did, which made my stillness feel louder. He arrived with the easy gait I knew. He sat and smiled in a way that had once been the kind of thing romance novels invent. I picked my words like small pebbles. I let the conversation be trivial and then allowed it to niche into the subject that would unmoor him. There are ways to draw a person into saying more than they plan. You ask about a memory, you mention a joke, you show interest. You place the subject gently and let them fill in the blanks. He spoke carelessly about meetings and errands, and then, as if sand sliding from a broken glass, he mentioned a client he'd taken out. He used the word investment in a way I know now was deliberate. That was our opening. Gently, I guided him toward the place where his words would tie to numbers. "The dinners?" I said, soft. "The gifts?" He gave me a look that was almost affectionate in its evasion. "Just clients," he said. "People who help my business." He smiled and reached for his cup. "You worry too much," he added with that practiced charm that had soothed so many of my anxieties before. I let him go on. I nudged with an anecdote about a shared acquaintance who had once misread a client relationship. I played my role like an actor, boring into him with calm interest until his guard softened. There are tiny tells people offer when they feel comfortable, the way they lean in, the way they drop an I in a phrase to make a confession less formal. He said a line about helping with accounts that sounded casual, but in context hinted at something more precise. It was not an admission of wrongdoing. It was not the neat confession I'd hoped for, but it was a fragment. It was a word that would later fit a ledger. I had my phone recording on the table, the legalities of which I had discussed with my lawyer, who advised me to take care, but also recognized that some states allow one-party recordings. I kept my hands open and my voice calm. I wanted him to be relaxed, to be himself, because that is when people reveal what they believe their trusted self can hide. Intentions in casual language, references to numbers, offhand mentions of accounts and shared assets. The bait worked in small ways. He laughed and made a joke about a client with extravagant tastes. He said, casually, "She likes to help me with the office. Little things." His words were like threads I could later weave into a case, but they were fragile and would need corroboration. After the lunch, my stomach weighed 1,000 small stones, and the recorder held a file I could later hand to counsel. Small victory. Proof is often less cinematic than you imagine. It is a folder, a sentence, a timestamp. It is the way a casual phrase sits in the middle of a recorded conversation. There were other tactics, subtler and quieter. I set email backups to forward copies of any messages to a secure account I controlled. I copied receipts I found in the garbage into a locked drawer. I put a small camera near the door in the garage, not to spy on private moments, but to timestamp comings and goings in case his movements did not match his stories. My moral lines were clear in my head. No entrapment, no false pretenses that would make me the aggressor. I wanted the truth, not to manufacture it. This carefulness came at a cost. There were late nights when my son would notice my every hurry. I learned to tuck fear into small, practiced smiles. I learned to braid my hair differently so he wouldn't ask why I looked tired. I pretended our routine was unbroken. Story at bedtime, a warm kiss on the forehead, the way his small hand found my cheek in the dark. I held him close and thought of ledgers and lawyers and the strange geometry of stolen innocence. There were tender, terrible moments in stolen hours. I would tuck him in and trace the small constellation of freckles on his arm and cry later in the car with the engine humming and the seatbelt pressing into my chest. I would think, this is what I'm fighting for, not revenge, not spectacle. A child who will grow up fed and safe. The emotional cost was registering as a slow erosion of sleep and the way my laugh felt borrowed. Obstacles surfaced. The plan began to wobble in tiny, infuriating ways. He changed routines the way a person avoiding footprints changes direction across a field. A lunch that had been on the calendar disappeared. Messages were cleared from his phone. I found an attempt to delete an app and my stomach clenched into a fist. The lover canceled an arrangement at the last minute. The friend I'd asked to help got cold feet and had to back out at the 11th hour. My carefully placed opportunities felt briefly like castle walls that might not hold. Each time, I had to pivot. There were rapid problem-solving moments. Small tactical adjustments you don't read about in novels because they are not romantic, only necessary. When the lunch fell through, I booked a meeting at a different cafe with a different friend who could play the same role but with less warning. When a message thread was scrubbed from his phone, I contacted the service provider to request archived copies. When the lover canceled, I found her name on a boutique gift receipt and called the shop, pretending to be a concerned customer. What is truth, if it must sometimes wear a mask? The shop clerk, bored and clear-eyed, read me a name and the last four of a number that matched a card I knew. It was a small, cold confirmation. The bank was both ally and obstacle. Bureaucracy slowed the engine of my anger into something more patient. I learned the magic words: suspicious activity, unauthorized transfer, please freeze. I learned to escalate politely. You can get much more accomplished with a calm tone and documentation than with fire and fury. When I asked for formal statements, the bank provided them but recommended I bring counsel if I sought court orders. The law, and those who practice it, are deliberate. It is a comfort once you accept the pace. And then I found a receipt that felt like the slam of a gavel. It was a small, folded piece of paper tucked into the back pocket of a jacket he had left on the hall chair. Maybe he didn't think a man would check his pockets, or maybe it was an honest forgetfulness. The receipt had his initials scrawled in a hurried hand on the back. The boutique name matched charges I had already seen. The date aligned with one of the large transfers I had flagged with the bank. The thrill of that find, private and quietly triumphant, felt like the first honest laugh I had in months. The paper was banal and damning. It tied a line of payments to a person. It tied intimacy to a ledger. With every small win, my resolve hardening. The plan took shape into something quite particular. Gather paper, preserve voice, freeze movement. I would not humiliate him for sport. I would not make our son an accomplice in the cruelty of public spectacle. I would take away the instruments of harm so that our child's life continued without learning how to barter love for security. But a predator, when cornered, does not always play clean. It was as if he began to sense the tightening. His step became faster. He left earlier, returned later. He began to ask small, suspicious questions. "Have you been looking at our accounts?" he asked one night, voice low. I felt the current of my plan ripple with the possibility that he might now move more aggressively, accelerate transfers, place backups with a notch of haste. That fear is a unique animal. You watch someone you love from across a room and try to read their intent like weather. He had always been a man capable of improvisation. Now he might improvise against me. That would mean there was a time limit. That would mean the ledger might move before the evidence was fully in place. I organized what I had into an evidence package. Printouts, timestamps, photographed receipts, recorded files saved both on the cloud and a USB drive hidden in my sock drawer like contraband. I listed steps for my lawyer. I rehearsed what I would say if bank personnel required a sworn statement. I rehearsed a calm voice in case he confronted me first. The world shrank to these pragmatic moves. Even as I arranged, I watched him watch me. He began to guard his phone more carefully, to take calls in the car, to smile in a manner that distant relatives might have confused with innocence. I turned our life into a chessboard and tried to keep 3 moves in front. And then, as if sensing the end was near, he did what predators do when the water narrows. He accelerated. There was a scheduled transfer he requested at the bank. It was the sort of thing that could be done with a signature or a phone call. The date was a blush on the calendar. I knew then that the clock had become a very real opponent. When he tried to move the money, I was already 2 steps ahead. The night I chose to end it, everything felt impossibly still, as if the whole world had been asked to hold its breath for exactly the right moment. I dressed in clothes that were ordinary and practical, a black coat that didn't shout, shoes that could run if they needed to. I carried a small folder of paper like a prayer book, printed statements, a list of timestamps, the recorded file from the cafe lunch, the receipt with his initials. My hands closed over the folder until the edges creased. The paper smelled faintly of ink and the cheap coffee I'd been using to keep myself awake for days. The plan was precise. Not dramatic, not a showdown on a billboard. The bank had been my ally. Their fraud department waited for my call. My lawyer sat 2 chairs away in a lobby that smelled of lemon disinfectant, and old magazines. He had a calm face. Calm people are useful in small, loud crises. He had a stack of forms I didn't read because his steadiness felt like reading. The bank manager came with a tablet and a gentle, almost practical compassion that made me glad the world still had ordered things to offer. Sound simplified into single threads that night. There was the hum of the lobby's lights, the single sustained string that seemed to elongate time inside my chest, and the distant thud of my own shoes on tile. When the door opened and he walked in, everything sharpened. He looked like the man I had known in small, soft ways. The same shirt, the same half-confident gait. He smiled when he saw the bank's staff. That smile had convinced me of many things. Tonight, it seemed like an old costume he'd slipped back on automatically. He did not know the orchestra waiting in the wings. We had staged the meeting as a routine visit so he wouldn't suspect. The bank manager greeted him as if he were any other client. He sat where clients sit. He did not notice my lawyer at first. He did not notice the little cluster we had arranged. A teller with a printed ledger, a bank officer with legal forms, the discreet presence of security standing near the back. He sat. He asked a polite question about a perk he thought important. He asked about transfer limits as if he were any other man with a busy day. I watched. My heart beat like a metronome in the space between my ribs. I could feel it as if it were a separate animal. The single string hummed. The bank officer tapped the screen, making a small, innocuous sound. "We can proceed with the scheduled transfer," the officer said, voice neutral. "We have a hold placed pending authorization." That sentence bloomed like a blossom I had planted weeks ago and was now watching open. The man's smile faltered by a fraction. My lawyer folded his hands. He slid my printed statements across a small table as if they were a menu. The recorded file sat on a phone with a little red dot that said, "Rec." I pressed play with my thumb under the table. His words from the cafe unfurled in the small glass box. Casual, unguarded. The kind of language men use when they believe their words will not be used as rope. "She helps me with accounts," he had said. "We sort things out." In the recording, his voice sounded stupidly, tragically ordinary. The voice of certainty. The voice that had forgotten who was listening. Slow motion is a strange, private thing. The moment his recorded voice filled the air, the world did that cinematic thing. Sound stretched, breaths slowed. I watched his mouth shape a new expression, small cracks that formed into an understanding. He blinked. He looked from the phone to my lawyer to the bank manager. The smile he wore at the door came apart like a face being erased. The bank alert pinged on my phone then. The sound loud in that small, held world. A message about a flagged transfer, the exact transaction number I had circled in my notebook. A paper fell softly from the officer's hand to the table. A security guard, polite as weather, stepped forward. The man's hands went briefly to his pockets as if searching for a defense that wasn't there. Those hands were the hands that had once tied our son's shoes. He stammered. His explanation had the thinness of warmed-over excuses. "It's a mistake," he said. This is for business." He looked at the bank manager as if he might invent a paper trail on the spot. The manager's face was small and polite and unimpressed. "All transfers of this size require authorization if they differ from historical patterns," she said. "We will need signed consent and verification. It is a small bureaucratic shield, the kind I had prayed would exist when I called the bank late one sleepless night." He faltered, then attempted to regain form. He laughed, a sound that did not reach his eyes. "It's a client. She helps with the startup. We gave her an advance. It's nothing personal," he said before he noticed the photograph on the table. A printout I had placed casually near the ledger. The photograph was the one my son had mirrored in his whisper, their hands together, her head near his shoulder, a private laugh mid-air between them. He looked as if someone had shown him his reflection for the first time and he did not like what he saw. I felt a strange lightness then, as though steel had been wrapped around my ribs. It was not triumph. It was relief overt. Relief like the cold after fever. I felt my breath slow. The single string softened, and the sound of my son's laugh from a memory slipped into my mind and steadied me. This was the moment I had prepared for. It had the quiet drama of the precise, careful hand that undoes a knot. He tried to talk his way out. He tried to paper over the spaces with words. The lover, she who had been the rumor in my son's small voice, was coaxed into the bank's small orbit. A clerk, having done their own work, had managed to secure a statement showing transactions linked to an account that included her name. She arrived looking startled, then defiant. Her posture flicked between the two like a faulty light. She said, "It's none of your business," in a voice bright with anger and a touch of fear. The words were brittle and did not land well in the room. We laid out the evidence, slow and tidy, receipts placed beside transfers, messages aligned next to timestamps. The recorded conversation sat like a needle in the center of a clock. The bank's printed ledger made small, incontrovertible marks. The lover's face collapsed from defiance to something else. Shame, perhaps, or the sudden realization of consequences that had not seemed real when plans were hatched in the dark. His reaction was the quietest kind of unraveling. He shuffled. He found he had no alibi that matched the paperwork. He began to talk faster. He named clients. He cited a million possibilities. Each sentence dissolved under the weight of the documents. His hands trembled when he reached for a pen. The pen slipped and rolled across the counter, a little sound like a small coin dropped. He stopped smiling altogether. I watched him shrink in the light that had once made him look handsome and safe. Public humiliation is a slow, subtle thing when done right. It is the way an honest ledger can cut a man down to the proportion of his truth. He had thought secrecy was armor. I had thought that being quiet might protect me. The ledger proved the world is not made of intentions but of recorded actions. The bank's policies had become the instrument that made private wrongs public. There was no shouting. There was instead an unbearable quiet. My son, who had been at his friend's house for the evening on my careful instruction, I could not have him there when truth became a spectacle, showed up at the curb anyway, having slipped away, his small face lit by street lamps, breathless from running. He darted forward the moment I stepped out of the bank, wrapping himself around my legs as if the world were a place that could still be fixed with a hug. I gathered him to me and felt the strange plasticity of joy and sorrow at once. He smelled like sweat and the cotton of a hoodie, and his head tucked into my coat as if the night could be repelled by a child's small warmth. I held him and heard his small voice ask, "Is Daddy okay?" Which was the most ordinary question and the most devastating. I wanted to answer fully. I wanted to tell him the story of money and betrayal and how adults are messy. Instead, I said simply, "We are going to be okay." The lie was a promise. It sounded like truth to both of us in that moment. Outside, the air had the sting of rain. It had just begun to fall in a fine, clean drizzle that smelled of asphalt and possibility. Rain smells like beginning. I let it land on my face and it felt like something being washed. The courthouse steps were cold the next morning. The rain had made the world honest. There were cameras of a sort that record human small drama, and there were paper forms and small meetings with officials who preferred ordinary language and legal process to the theatrics I had briefly entertained in my mind. The bank froze the accounts. Notices went out. The transfers were halted. We had bought time. There were consequences in the months that followed, consequences both practical and intimate. The bank placed legal holds on funds that kept our savings intact for the time being. A mediated meeting, the kind where two people show up with someone neutral and an agreement is hammered out, forced his hands to be seen. He had to sign disclosures to allow for auditing. I do not want to write legal manuals here. The point is, the world responded with procedure. The machine of accountability, slow and creaky as it is, can be effective when the evidence is clean. He tried explanations. He tried a story about business needs and miscommunication and a woman who was helping. He attempted to fold what he'd done into the language of good intentions. The more he spoke, the more the ledger contradicted him. He said she was helping with logistics. The receipts showed dinners at hotels, gifts delivered to private addresses where no company meetings happen. The lover alternated between angry denials and small admissions that shed light on the casual cruelty of the whole affair. At one point, she sobbed, then hushed herself and said, "I didn't know." It was the most dangerous and useless defense in the world. Public unraveling is never purely satisfying. There is a cost that sits heavy like wet clothing. The man I had loved, the one who once knew the pattern of my laugh, who once held my hand as our son was born, now needed to answer in a room where strangers read numbers like scripture. I felt no joy in his shaking. I felt grief that the life we had built had been so thin at its seams. The revenge I had engineered was not about making him small for sport. It was about reclaiming the ordinary sanctuaries of our child, the roof, the account, the future. People came with opinions, friends chose sides. Some offered the mercy of silence. Some offered small practical help, bringing casseroles and school runs. The legal machinery hummed along, issuing temporary orders and scheduling hearings. The papers asked for statements. I gave them calmly because calm is the instrument of power in these things. It is amazing how paperwork can steady a trembling heart. Triumph, when it came, felt like an inhalation after a long time holding your breath. It was not loud. No one shouted. The money remained where it needed to be. The man's name became a subject of conversations I did not want to have with strangers, but the worst fear, our son being stripped of possibility, was kept at bay. I had protected him, which is the word that loops in my mind like a mantra, and yet grief lived in the margin of that triumph. I grieved the version of us that had existed in comfortable ignorance. I grieved for the family milestones that would be altered. Divorce, separation, the slow reweaving of a life into two smaller ones. Those realities sat like a dull ache. There is a price to reclaiming your life from someone you once trusted. It is the price of recognition. You trade illusions for facts. You trade ease for vigilance. That trade is fair, but it is not painless. I extracted myself from the courtroom of small domestic horrors and walked for a while without speaking. I learned to let silence be a kind of answer. I learned to be careful with whom I gave my narratives. I learned that dignity is an active thing. The way you speak softly in grocery lines, the way you refuse to make your child practice grief as a lesson. I kept my head down and my voice steady when necessary. I taught my son the shape of quiet strengths. Tell the truth, I said. Protect what matters. On a late afternoon, a few months after the bank matter was settled, I walked through the park with my son holding my hand. The leaves had turned, and the air had the brittle, certain taste of early winter. He chattered about school, about a math problem, about how he'd made a fort out of couch cushions. I listened and let the sounds of his small domestic life stitch me in places that had been hollowed out. The world was ordinary again, and ordinary felt enormous. I think about courage a lot now. Not the cinematic kind that burns bright and loud, not the kind that ruins people purely for the thrill of watching them fall, the quiet kind. The kind that plans and waits and sees the small calculations of harm and refuses them. The kind that chooses to act not out of spectacle but out of duty, to a child, to a future, to a life you'd promised yourself you would protect. He never expected the quiet kind of courage that comes from a mother protecting her child. He expected drama or nothing. He did not prepare for ownable, steady, meticulous action. That is the thing about small, honest strategies. They do not make noise at once, but they are devastating in their efficiency. They take back what is yours without teaching lessons in cruelty. At night, when my son sleeps and the house breathes in the slow rhythm we have rebuilt, I sometimes feel a flicker of sadness for what was lost. Then, I run my fingers over the small stack of paper, now filed, labeled, archived. And I think of college applications, of rainy day roofs, of soccer cleats and trip permission slips. I fold the sadness into a deliberate gratitude. We have our quiet life back. It is not the life I imagined when I was young and naive. It is better in the way real things are better, softer, scarred, and fiercely held. There is a tidy kind of justice in stories, and then there is the messy, patient work of real life. What I found in the middle of all that mess was not vengeance for its own sake, but a return of dignity. Secrets cost you more than money. They cost nights you cannot get back, the small trust in mornings, the casual laugh that once belonged to two people. Karma is not always loud. Sometimes it is a ledger and a quiet phone call to the bank. Sometimes it's patience and paperwork. Sometimes it is the steady refusal to let someone else rewrite your child's future. I learned that self-respect is practical. It is not a single grand gesture. It is freezing an account. It is printing statements. It is walking into a room with calm and a folder that holds the truth. It is teaching a child that honesty matters more than excuses. The strength that mattered in the end was not dramatic. It was ordinary, stubborn, and relentless, showing up every day, gathering proof, protecting what you love. If there is one thing I want you to carry away from this story, it is this. Justice can be smart and steady. It doesn't have to be cruel to be final. You do not need to humiliate to be righted. You do not need to plunge into ruin to reclaim what is yours. You can be careful. You can be tactical. You can be kind to the people who will still matter tomorrow, even as you make sure those who would harm you can no longer reach what belongs to your family. If this revenge saga gave you that rush of justice, smash like, subscribe for more epic tales, and share your revenge story in the comments. Click the next video box for another one. Imagine the camera pulling back slowly now. My son at the sunny window, the soft light on his hair, the smallness of his hand in mine. Soft music swells and fades. Months later, the accounts remain frozen, the college jar untouched, and we have a quiet life that smells of lemon cleaner and possibility.